Audiotest 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Ja, das klingt bei mir mal gut.
Das hier?
Ja, klingt bei mir gut. Sprich nochmal was.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3,
Ja, das klingt für mich gut einmal bis hier. Dein Mikrofon. So, wieder mal. Dein Mikrofon klingt einmal gut. Welches ist das? Welcher Tonkanal?
5.
So. So, das passt. Wenn das passt, warte mal ein bisschen lauter noch. So, wenn es jetzt da passt, dann müsste da auch passen.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Da hören wir gar nichts jetzt. 1,
To listen to this discussion, we had a seminar today with a group of editors of Journal of Ideas, opinion pages of some of the major American and European East and West publications. So we decided that you're going to have a taste of it, having this discussion, and this very much goes with the major discussion which the Vienna Humanities Festival starts with, the problem of power and powerlessness. So there are two different ways to see what is happening to the media. On one level, they look very powerless. On the other, they have so many enemies that probably they are not so powerless anyway. So it's my great pleasure to give the floor to John Palattella, who was the person who basically organized intellectually our discussion today.
Thank you, Ivan. The fault is that I was brief. Very brief, thank you. My name is John Palattella, and I'm a visiting fellow at the EVM, and I'm also an editor for a magazine in New York, in the United States, called The Point, that is published 3 times a year. And previously, I was the literary editor of The Nation, which is a weekly magazine in the United States, and I was responsible for coverage of literature, arts, visual culture, history, ideas, pretty much everything under the sun. The theme of our, as Ivan said, talk tonight is power and powerlessness in the media. And the focus of this discussion is going to be about how recent political and technological developments have changed the ways in which editors and writers go about their business, and how these developments have altered power relations within publications and between publications and readers. We will talk for 45 minutes to an hour, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. And I'm joined tonight from my left by Katarzyna Wężyk, who lives in Warsaw and writes for Gazeta Wyborcza. She's been a visiting fellow at EVM and has also written a book about Canada. To her left is Thomas Chatterton Williams. He's an American who is now living in Paris. He's a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine and has been a fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. His first book is called Losing My Cool, Love Literature in a Black Man's Escape from the Crowd. And finally, Elisabeth von Thadden is an editor at Die Zeit. She's also been an editor at the Berliner Wochenpost and Berliner Zeitung. So thank you all for joining me for this conversation. So I'd like to start with a very simple question for all of you. How have recent political shifts altered what gets covered and how it gets covered?
This is not an easy question. Who's going to be the first? Okay, so as I represent Poland, we just moved from being this success story of post-communist transformation to be a living proof that liberal democracy doesn't work in Eastern Europe in the long term. So maybe I can tell you something of how does journalistic work looks in a country which maybe is not yet authoritarian, but still yet, I would say it's authoritarian curious, or as Viktor Orban memorably put it, it's an illiberal democracy. So if you're expecting heroic stories about journalists who would risk their life or health or income, thankfully I don't have them yet. But yes, we have state propaganda, which is bludgeoning its viewers with state media, which are bludgeoning its viewers with propaganda. Yes, and the journalists who work there, if we still can call them journalists, were given a choice either to put up with it or to leave, and many of them stayed because state media pays well, and private school costs money, and you have a mortgage to pay. But this propaganda isn't convincing. The main news program lost like 40% of viewers in the last 3 years. So this kind of blunt statements, blunt pro-government statements, are counterproductive. What else? Journalists from private media, yes, they are being sued, but they were being sued before, because that's kind of perks of a job, and no one was so far jailed. And yes, politicians from the ruling party do attack private media routinely. Like Prime Minister would say that 80% of private media is against the government and they're enemies of the people. Or another politician would say that 92% of private media is in German hands, or which is not true by the way, and work for foreign interest and foreign read German. And so on, but it isn't that much different from what Donald Trump tweets at 5 a.m., enemies of the people, and so on. But what is different is that PiS government has means to urbanize Polish media. It often threatens to deconcentrate or to repolonize media, so it would finally serve sovereign Polish interest. And PiS politicians sometimes allude to the fact that the law which would do it is ready, but just waiting for a political decision by Jarosław Kaczyński. And it is waiting because Poland has enough problems with European Union without curbing private media straightforwardly. Plus, there was an attempt to punish independent TV station for covering for protests, but PiS government is quite incompetent because this media is owned by Discovery, and Discovery is an American company, and there was a phone call from State Department, and no one's talking about this fee anymore. But there are more subtle forms of censorship, like showing the media that being for PiS has its perks and being against PiS has its consequences. Like a state-owned company have to make announcements in newspaper with big coverage, like new contracts or new auctions, and it usually went to my newspaper, but not anymore because we want, and it was a big source of revenue in this current lousy newspaper market, but not anymore. They all go to pro-government press. What else? They are trying to secure better treatment from the only media which is perceived as neutral. This is Polsat TV station, and its owner has another businesses in energy market and in telecommunication market. So there are talks about they made a deal so that his news station would treat PiS more friendly, not outright propaganda, but more friendly, and he will gonna have free hand on those markets. So on one hand, we have natural for these liberal regimes with autocratic tendencies to push to take over the media, to have only one narrative, one dominant narrative with no dissenting voices. But on the other hand, that's an illusion. With the internet, with social media, you cannot have one narrative. But there's a problem. If you take over or close any dissenting media. Of course, you can have journalists who are publishing on the internet, but there are two problems. Not everyone would like or have means to find those news, and plus journalists have to eat. So if you don't have independent means, that kind of independent work is, being a watchdog to power for free isn't a long-term option. But there's also a third side to that, because does this illiberal government really have to control whole narrative? I was talking quite recently with my former colleague who now works for state media, and I asked him, we have this municipal election coming, what if they didn't win? Are we going to punish, private media? Are we going to tell that, they told lies, that's the reason why we lost, we have to punish them? He told me, there's no chance we're going to convince your readers. So why should we do it? Why should they do it? It's better to leave them be. What else? I could talk about polarization, but polarization is such a cliche. It's a word used everywhere for explaining everything. But I would like to say a little bit about this one side of polarization, which is worrying for me because it makes journalists permanently stuck in this game with very high stakes, which is for both sides of political system, and it requires using tactics and vocabulary which wears out easily. By bombastic phrases like big words with capital letters, end of times rhetoric, and it's used by both sides. And it creates this mood of permanent anxiety and moral panic, which is difficult to maintain. And if you cry wolf too often, nobody would listen to you if the wolf comes. So my paper, for example, published during election 3 years ago, we published the headline, "Stake for this election is democracy." And we are right? But it was published before peace government got power, before they had a chance to prove that that they are actually trying to do this anti-democratic shift, and it was perceived as sour grapes, as the elites are fighting with democratically chosen people, and it's they didn't convince anyone, as I don't think that pro-Hillary editorials convinced many Trump voters not to vote Donald Trump. So yeah, that's about it.
How have political shifts changed what gets published? What gets covered and how? If we include books in the conversation as well as if we include books in the conversation as well as magazines. Just from my own experience, I can talk about. I published my first book in 2010, a kind of coming-of-age memoir about being black in America and coming to the growing realization that I was an agent in a country with a history of racism, but that I had a degree of control over my own life and could shape my own sense of self. And that was kind of uncontroversial to sell that book and to have major publishers come on board to publish it, even to take it to auction. It was at a moment when Barack Obama was ascendant. There was a lot of optimism. About 3 years after my book came out, the movement for Black Lives became a very big focal point of activism and kind of made people reevaluate the place of African Americans in American society. And what became acceptable to talk about began to change in the minds not just of readers or audiences, but certainly in the minds of gatekeepers and publishers and editors. And so when I came, I don't think I could have sold my first book after 2013, actually, and I don't think that's just a supposition. When I brought my second book to sell to some of the same editors. And it's a continuation of kind of reflection on my life and a discussion of racial identity through my own experiences and observations. But it's an argument against racial identity. It's a kind of it's a stepping out of the black-white binary. And I think we're at a time of identity politics and balkanization of identities where that's considered outside of the consensus position. And so I would have editors come and tell my agent that the writing was fine, they liked the book, they would like to publish it, but it kind of cuts against what the consensus view is now, and that might not be the right position for the House to take, and that they would have to pass. And that was shocking at first when I haven't that. So for me, that represents, in a tangible way, the writing is the same, the arguments are the same, but there are windows in which you can certain positions are viable and when they are not. And so for the kind of writing about identity that I do, I can see in the past 10 years there's been quite a shift. And then maybe now we're shifting back to a reopening, because I think we got so deep from 2013 through the Trump election, we got so deep into a kind of identity essentialism that I think a lot of people in the middle are kind of exhausted and are again opening up and wanting to find some type of middle ground.
Well, what I can say is quite different, because I'm speaking for a huge liberal weekly European newspaper in a still working liberal democracy. But still, I mean, the difference might be interesting then, because I'm working in an institution which tries to win trust, not only to keep the trust of its former readers, but to win new trust. And we have definitely moved. The clear answer to John's question is yes. These political shifts have altered our work in a deep sense of the word. What has actually happened concretely? Well, first of all, we opened our pages for more conservative voices in order to be more controversial as possible, to get as much contradiction as possible. Contradiction and controversy are organized now. The topics have changed as well. Take as an example the huge cover story about a rape. We would never have made a cover story about a rape before. It was the rape of a German young woman by a refugee man. And I think you can suspect that we had enormous and vivid controversies inside the newspaper as well, whether we should do that cover story at all. And but the main thing was that it was an investigative story, and we sent out 8 journalists for weeks and months in order to investigate that story. Why do I insist on investigating that story? Because we are hardly trying to do what Timothy Snyder was talking about last night. We are trying to produce facts, and this is something which has changed. Of course, we have always tried our best to be as factual as ever possible, but now to write a story like the one about the rapes means a different type of working. We try to be transparent, for example. Every and each huge article like this has now a little transparency article published next to it, saying whom did we talk to, how long did it take to write this story, who didn't want to talk to us, how long did it take to convince somebody to talk to us. We try to be as transparent as we possibly can, and we gave us guidelines in order to be recognizable for the public. This was a long and very controversial work as well, but now you can read in the internet the guidelines of Die Zeit. Why do I... Well, one more thing actually, we localized our work as well. We went back to the local and to the regions. We have a special edition now for Austria, another one for Switzerland, another one for Eastern Germany, and a 4th one for Hamburg, where we produce our main edition of Die Zeit. But all these things are easy to say because the company, the owner of Die Zeit, is one of the most prominent media companies in Europe. So I know well it is all a question of money. And the independence which we try to keep as an expression of the political shifts, of course depends on money as well, but not only on money. We have been thinking so hard about our job, about the job we do, and sometimes it seems to me as if the main shift was fighting the objection that we produce fake news and that we are what Germans call Lügenpresse. The quality press has been challenged so hardly that we did all we could and still do in order to reject these objections. So the whole profession has changed in a very deep way. And well, I hope we go a good way.
Was there any debate on the staff about the introduction of this sidebar about transparency, and putting that in the public instead of keeping that as a principle among the staff, but not letting the public know about it?
There's a huge controversy on everything. And days are very long now because nobody agrees on nothing, and that feels very vivid and that feels very passionate, and it is a great experience to go through, but it is very tiring as well. So there is colleagues who say we won't do that transparency thing. That is a step too far towards
in what
the
way?
reader. A step too far towards the reader, because it would just hurt our professional ethos to tell our mysteries to people who have to trust us. I mean, a doctor wouldn't say, wouldn't tell the patient anything about what he's doing, but keep some things for himself. But we decided to be as transparent as ever possible. And I mean, I first thought that you were asking me the question how I thought about the editorial, which we now printed on the first page of the Zeit. I think everybody knows what I'm talking about. For the first time in the history of our newspaper, the chief editors apologized for an article which was printed on the third page of the previous edition. Was what had happened. We had decided that we would publish a controversy on the distress rescue, the voluntary distress rescue on the Mediterranean Sea. Should people be allowed to rescue refugees on the Mediterranean, or should it be forbidden? And we had one article in favor of the refugee rescuing on the Mediterranean Sea and one article against it. And the headline overall was sollen wir es einfach lassen? Should we just stop rescuing them? And our readers reacted by a shitstorm. It was amazing how furious they got about this headline. So the headline actually was the reason why finally the chief editors wrote and apologized on the first page of the Zeit. But this is to say, we started to be a breathing newspaper. Dialoguing is now 50% of the job, and we're in a permanent discussion with our readers now. We might go deeper into that transformation later on, but this is what is the main transformation of the job, that we now talk about the mistakes we make, that now we and there's readers who say, but you are authorities, you are gatekeepers, you are not supposed to apologize for what you do, you have to stand for it. So that's the controversy.
That's interesting, because you're talking about how the newspaper has recognized that its perception of its authority has changed, and that it needs to do things very transparently to shore up that sense of authority. So, Thomas and Kasia, have you found as writers over the last 3 or 4 years that you've asked yourself about your own sense of authority, and have you sensed it? I mean, Tom, you do reporting as well. Have you sensed the need to shore it up somehow because you sense that your audience has shifted, or you want to reach a different kind of audience that previously you weren't aware of? Or has it become much more prominent now?
I haven't changed which audience I try to reach, excuse me. But I do find that the way that the industry works with the elite publications that you basically want to work for, especially to do reporting and things like that, is there's a tacit kind of understanding of what's acceptable there. And so you end up kind of catering to that even against your own will as a writer. Even if you think you're being a bit contrarian, you end up, to publish a piece in the New Yorker, you have to write your piece in a way that can be published in the New Yorker. And so I had the experience of, and I really admire the New Yorker, and I loved the experience of writing there, but I was reporting on the far right in France and the influence of the far right on the alt-right in America. And I decided, I was in Italy and I wanted to go to a town outside of Florence called Prato that is extraordinarily Chinese now. It's one of the most important textile villages in the history of Italy, and it used to be it used to be the pride of Italy for Italian textile manufacturing, and now it's essentially Chinese textile manufacturing. And I just thought that this was, when you're presenting, and I consider myself a liberal, but when you're presenting people who believe that demographic change in Europe is very important, and when you're presenting them as their point of view, I think it's important to paint a picture of some of what is exciting them, and to allow a reader, an intelligent reader, to make conclusions about that without editorializing it or holding their hand through it. I quickly, through the editing process, became aware that if the piece were to be published, no one told me this, but if the piece were to be published, that scene had to come out, because implicitly it lent support to an argument that I think the comment in the margins was, it's not clear enough where your sympathies lie, which kind of really scared me, to be honest, you know, because I didn't think that my job was, I write op-eds sometimes where I am arguing a point, but I was reporting a piece. I'm a black man living in Paris. I'm not in favor of the Nouvelle Droite. But I also think that if you pretend that they have no arguments that can resonate, then you're going to miss what's going on.
Had you written for the New Yorker previous to this piece?
For the print, that was my only piece for the print magazine.
Okay. But for the website?
For the website I have.
And the question of...
Same. I had it from a different angle. But actually, I have problems, I guess, at the New Yorker. But I also, the website, 50-50. One piece worked fine, and one piece did cut against the editorial tone, and eventually I withdrew it because it was never killed, but it kind of just languished, you know. And I ended up publishing it in the London Review of Books.
So the question of them not being clear where your sympathies were, and so.
Yeah, it's never, the thing is that you have a certain degree of uncertainty as a writer, and then you self-correct, anticipating what, if you want to get your piece published, you anticipate what will make it publishable in ways that, maybe this has always been the case, but it seems that now with social media, the backlash and the repercussions are so much more severe than when it was a letter to the editor. So the editors are more sensitive to, you know, making sure that that they don't invite that backlash. So the whole thing seems to really like work at warp speed and to reinforce itself, in my experience.
Kasha, this question of your sense of authority as a writer and reporter, has that shifted at all for you in the last 4 or 5 years?
Well, I would ask if there is any sense of authority for a journalist. You know, there's this digital news report by Reuters. And I checked it, those are numbers for Poland, but they're not the worst. So 48% of Poles trust the information they got from the media, and just 55% trust the information from the media they like and read. You know, 34% avoid news altogether because they think that either media is lying or news is gonna put them into bad mood. So, you know, if only half of people trust the media, a little more than half trust the media they like, and a little less than half avoid news altogether. And it's not just Poland. In US, I think 34% of people trust the media. So what kind of authority are you speaking of if, you know, half of people think we are lying, basically? And, you know, there's this wave of distrust to many public institutions, and, you know, media are not that bad. Politicians are still way lower. But, you know, we are not seen anymore as people who speak truth to power, but we are seen as allies of power. And yes, especially in authoritarian regimes, media can be, like in Hungary, when I was told like 90% of media market is vassalized by Viktor Orban. But, you know, even if in democracies, journalists are seen just, you know, as a part of hated elites, which is also kind of funny because we are not we're not the elites, and digital revolution made our jobs more precarious. Newspaper publishing revenues are getting low. Print advertising plunged. My newspaper, for example, went from 500,000 copies in pre-digital age to 90,000 now, which is a huge plunge with all the consequences you probably all know, layoffs and cutting, especially investigative department, opinions cheap. Fastest growing business in my parent company, Agora, which owns my paper, it's not my newspaper anymore. We're losing business. Fastest growing business is selling tickets to cinemas they own. So, and you know, and it's also the loss of prestige. Back then, when you hit the main newspaper in your country, you were someone. You had a voice. People would listen to you. You were paid considerably well, and not anymore. I remember, like 5 years ago, one of my colleagues on his blog wrote that it's outrageous that, you know, he works in #1 Polish newspaper, so it's like he was playing Real Madrid, and he cannot afford to take his wife to Frankfurt Marathon. And this is outrageous, he doesn't agree with that. So we don't write that stuff anymore, but it was the attitude, like, you know, we should be considered someone better. So, I don't know, there's also one thing which, in terms of how we interact with our readers, really bothered me. There was this conference on future of journalists in Warsaw. I think it's a very popular topic right now. And we're talking about this project called Spięcie, which means clash, but with a sparks. And this is a pretty interesting project, because 5 venues, smaller ones, intellectual ones, representing from very far, from the left through liberals to right, Christian right. They pick a topic like pensions or like constitution, and they pick an author. Each and every venue picks one author, and you know they write 5 pieces, and those 5 pieces are published in each and every one. So the readers of those websites have access to 5 different points of view, which is rather rare nowadays. So we're talking about this project, and there was this American journalist who asked the guy who invented this project, but you know, how do you justify it to your readers? Because if I had this close cooperation with right-wing readers, my Twitter followers would ostracize me, they would eat me, they would stop following me. And this is sad, because you know, we don't have to be independent not only from the government or from big business, but we have to also be independent from our own readers. It's, you know, it's my voice. It's not, I'm not just a tube for some aggregated readers, right?
Picking up on that, Elisabeth, you were talking a minute ago about how editorial changes have been made to shore up the paper's authority. Has the paper only done that within the paper, or has it try to do that outside of the paper?
Well, yes, and I mean, this is more or less a direct answer to what Kasia said. We have to remain independent from our readers, yes. This is always my first paragraph, and whatever I say, that whomever I meet, I always say, but attention, I might write very critically about you tomorrow. I'm not your friend, I'm a journalist, but we go towards our readers. And this is a new strategy of my newspaper, which I do support, which I find the right thing to do, but which has maybe its price, and we don't know the price yet. But the thing is interesting, we decided to become an actor in the democratic arena and strengthen deliberation as an active participant in the debate. This means that I'm just coming from a conference where we invited 2,000 of our readers. 2,000 of our readers came, and we discussed with them not only what a newspaper is or should be, we discussed with them what the common good is, what a good life is. I organized a new type of discussion, a critical reading of new books. We chose Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now and discussed 300 readers and me what this book was about, a new type of critical reading or reviewing a book. So, of course, this is very controversial as well. Me personally, I think it is the right thing to do. I always tell all these readers that I'm a critical journalist and will do my job wherever I go. But still, we have the feeling that trust building means meeting people vividly, not in the digital world, exchanging arguments, contradicting lively, hearing what people say, and in a way, this is my point of view, coming back to the very beginnings of pre-democratic enlightenment in Europe, where in the year 1784, Carl Philipp Moritz said, a journal has to go towards its readers as citizens of the town, of the polis, and consider them as agents, not only as readers, in order to strengthen their agency and in order to got enlightened by their critique as well. So this is the way we chose, and keep your fingers crossed that independency won't be damaged. It depends on our readers as well.
I'm curious, what were some of the arguments that the paper made against doing this?
Well, first of all, we are a couple of hundreds of different voices. So, and this diversity is everything. This is our capital, this diversity. So I can't quote 700 voices, but I find this point of diversity and controversialism so important. The arguments against it were the arguments Kasia just mentioned. We have to keep our distance. Our job is the critical distance to the society we have to write about, and we don't have to mix up with people we are writing about. This is the main argument. Of course, the second argument is very simple. It says we are a brand on the market, and all we want to do is to be bought and read. So it is all more or less well-hidden merchandising what we are doing, and this is inadequate. We have no legitimation whatsoever to appear in the democratic sphere and say that we want to act in a sphere without being deputies of this public sphere. But all this is true to my mind, and still I would say if you are clear and transparent on the way you're speaking, that you're not that you don't go on the markets in order to sell your newspaper, but because you're worried about democracy and deeply worried about the problems we face at present. This is a different thing. And I would always say it is very inconvenient, and it is a lot of work to travel through the country and go on local markets in order to engage discussions. It is really not only a pleasurable thing, and people, well, I think they feel it. They feel it that we are worried about democracy.
Now, this is a question for all of you. Changes like this and some of the others you've spoken about, do you see them as tactics for the times, or have they given you pause and maybe prompted you to reconsider whether or not we should have been doing something like this all along?
What do you mean by something like this?
Engaging with readers more directly, or changing the way stories are presented, significant changes in the way the news is presented to a reader, either in print or, in this case, in person. Is this just a defensive measure until the political climate changes, or do you see this as something permanent and maybe should have been permanent long ago?
I think it was Timothy Snyder who said last night that societies should have become aware earlier that newspapers have to be strengthened, that they don't have the power by themselves to survive in a digital world. This is partly true. I think we should have started it earlier, and I think we should have tried to found endowments, trust-like helpings, financial helpings for all these newspapers who can't afford it themselves. But the dialogue with the society, to my mind, is the logic consequence of what has been enlightened journalism before. The dialoguing journalism, to my mind, is what fits best in a democratic society. But of course, we have to do the job nevertheless. We first have to write the articles, and we first have to print them, and then discuss them. So it's the double work. So we need the double of the staff. And the one will never be a substitute for the other. So for me, it takes to write an article with a substance which I think can be published, needs a couple of weeks to be written, and then discuss it afterwards with the public means another couple of weeks. So, and the day has 24 hours, so it is just a new workload, that is all.
Well, we live in a world, thanks to digital revolution, of a democratization of communication and content, and this is the reality, and there's no use to take offense with that. And in around quarter century, I think, we moved from the world of Gutenberg, the communication which was one to many. We do model, the limited number of centralized communicators, big newspapers, big TV stations, radio station, in which cost of broadcasting was also high. You could either own the station or you could work for the station. There was no other way before the internet. And now we move to, Zuckerberg's world of many-to-many communication, where anyone can publish any content their heart desire, and if it's interesting enough, a Twitter make it viral. And social media is alerted the dynamics of distribution. There are no gatekeepers anymore, and the race is open. Established media have to compete with smaller venues, or even with bloggers, YouTubers, and active Twitter users. And in this new media environment, there is no, assumed authority. There is no Walter Cronkite who would tell you how it is. And there's, communication is not one-sided anymore. It's not like I do the speaking and you do the listening. I'm active, you're passive, and if you don't like what I say, you can send a letter to editor. Printing not guaranteed, right? So the relationship with the audience had to change. It had to become more democratic and less hierarchical. And this shift, of course, has its advantages. First, journalists and media outlets cannot become complacent. It's a theory. Competition should force mainstream media to strive for excellence, to be constantly reinvent themselves, to look for a better way to reach new audience and to keep the old ones. Secondly, internet enables us to interact with the audience. Sometimes, of course, it bruises your ego when someone in the comment section or Twitter proves that he or she knows better on any given subject than you do. That happens. But, in the older days, we would stay in a blissful obliviousness. Now, not anymore. But, it also enables you to correct your mistakes, to be better next time, to stay humble. And, also, if you're lucky, you can also get a scoop for the audience, for the readers. It shows, in a way, that this pre-digital, one-sided journalism could never do. What really interests our audience? What kind of stories do they like? What find exciting and worth sharing? But those are the good sides, but it's not all roses, unfortunately. What it turns out that your audience is more interested with a video with a guy on a kayak which was being hit by a seal with an octopus. And I kid you not, Google it, but not now, please. This is a great video. I was laughing on the way on the Warsaw airport, very loud. Or if we switch to American politics, what if readers are more interested in graphic details of Donald Trump's anatomy, described very vividly by Stormy Daniels, than graphic details of his administration, described less vividly by Bob Woodward, right? So shall we focus more on still videos and on scandals to generate clicks and shares? I think that's a question maybe more editors ask themselves than journalists, because chasing clicks can dumb down journalism.
I just find it very disturbing and scary, the development. And we talked a bit about Ian Baruma at the New York Review of Books today. But the story that was even a little bit more scary to me was what happened with David Remnick at the New Yorker, and he didn't lose his job, but he lost an extraordinary amount of authority, I think. And I think that once you...
Can you read?
Yeah, I'll explain. Once you lose a certain amount of authority, it doesn't just walk back. So the New Yorker Festival is not exactly an article, but the editor-in-chief is organizing the New Yorker Festival and inviting guests, and David Remnick, the editor-in-chief of the New Yorker, decided he would interview Steve Bannon and interview him aggressively, is how he described his plans for the exchange. And then readers and some guests like Jim Carrey and Judd Apatow, and then some junior staff members at the New Yorker said, no, that's not acceptable. Remnick held for a few hours, and then he reversed himself, and he released this letter that was kind of very scary, because it was about a page and a half long, And the first 90% of it was a very well-reasoned argument for why you engage someone with ideas that you may even find repellent, and you interrogate them and you expose their ideas to the light of sun. And then the last paragraph was, but well-meaning subscribers and some of my junior staff felt very strongly that this was the wrong thing to do, so we're not going to go for it. And then some people said on Twitter, well, Twitter is now effectively the editor-in-chief of the New Yorker. That is who edits the New Yorker now. And it's hyperbole, but it's also not completely wrong.
Well, how does that, you're a writer, so how does that...
So as a writer watching that on Twitter, just observing, it's a message about what's acceptable. The window is closing about what type of stories the New Yorker stands for, what type of opinions are allowed in, what type of ideas will be entertained. Some people were saying that the New Yorker Festival is nothing to worry about. It's just a festival. It's entertainment. But I think that these things, these symbols, and these kind of exchanges and how they play out actually mean a great deal more than just it's one festival. It's no big deal. I think he really lost authority that day. And the institution did, and we don't have too many institutions. We don't have any institution like the New Yorker anymore. That's sui generis. There's no other magazine like that in America, and for that to falter, for that to be subject to reversals dictated by the mob, it makes me scared.
What about the counter arguments from some of the people on the staff? Why this person already has a bullhorn? Why give him a platform in front of a different audience just to say what he has been saying about politics for the last 3 or 4 years?
I don't think that Steve Bannon says many interesting things or needed to be invited in the first place. But once the editor-in-chief makes a decision to invite him, he's invited. And it's the real weakness comes in the reversal, I think. And that's where the damage was done. It could have easily been avoided by not inviting him in the first place, and then you have to wonder why the editor is so out of touch with his readership and his staff to not anticipate the type of backlash that happened. But once the invitation is out, the reversal, dictated by people who are not who are literally not at that level of authority, it concedes too much, and I think that. I think it's a new space that we're in right now, and you're seeing it in several instances, but this one was the one that really shook me.
Have you seen something similar to this in your newsroom at all?
Well, it's most disturbing what you're saying, and I think you're right to stress the fact that a chief editor has to be a chief editor. Else how, there is no difference any longer between the fourth power, which the press is, and the fifth power, which society is. But having said this, I would still like to say that our experiences with the fifth power, which is the professionalized critical citizen as a reader, who now controls the press and tells us how he thinks about our work, I think this is a necessary step to take in the improvement of democracies, but not in order to see humiliations of chief editors as you have just described them. My idea and my hope would be that the fifth power can strengthen the authority of newspapers once our decisions are taken, once our decisions are transparent, once we give good reasons for our decisions after having debated with the fifth power, with society. I would hope that our authority would be broadened and would be strengthened. And so I have not seen any case like you just have described, and I don't want to see those, actually. I don't want to see a chief editor constrained or haunted or hunted by, you rightly said, the mob, and to release an invitation which he had pronounced before. But I remember very well writing a long essay on the free speech and the question, whom do we talk to, Democrats, and whom don't we? And while I was writing it, there was the news popping up that Alexander Gauland, the chief of the German populist AfD, had been invited to Vienna, to the Burg Theater, and people were wondering whether this was a good idea or not. So the question is popping up without an end, and it is constantly a challenge. You will never close that dossier and say that you're through with it. We will have to re-deliberate on any occasion who is the people, who has the right to speak and who is not. And as they want to blame us for being the system, I always think that those who want to destroy the system, those who want to destroy democracy, are people whom I'm not going to talk with. But all those who want to improve democracy are very welcome. But I know how difficult it is, what I'm saying, because we have been discussing all these different concepts of democracies today. Sovereign democracy, liberal democracy, people's democracy. So what kind of democracy are we talking about? The one thing I want to keep is the chief editor, to be honest.
One thing that also comes to mind is that The Economist also invited Steve Bannon to their festival, their conference, and there were calls for them to resend the invitation as well. But the editor-in-chief of The Economist said no. That was it. I made the decision. He's still coming. And in fact, The Economist still works. And it's kind of, it shows that you can still say no. I make this decision, and the world continues, and The Economist still is on the shelf over there, and it still has readers, and it will survive. But these kind of points at which you draw a line, I think that they matter.
Also, I had recently an argument with someone. What's the difference between banning Milo Yiannopoulos from Berkeley and banning Alex Jones from YouTube and from Facebook and other social media? And, instinctively, I am for banning Alex Jones because he's a conspiracy theorist who made a lot of people suffer because for example, he says that Sandy Hook didn't happen and he sent all those crazy people to Sandy Hook parents. But what's the difference? And I think the difference is that if you give Alex Jones voice on YouTube, he's not being contradicted. He just can send his toxic thoughts to the internet and people will just listen. It's one-sided communication. But if you allow someone like Milo to go to Berkeley, you can always contradict him. You can always say it's bullshit. You can always, you can always find better arguments than he has. I think you should at least try to do it, because if you don't, you just keep him away and give him a satisfaction of being martyred of free speech, which is also funny.
I think this is a good point to turn the mic over to the audience for questions.
I have a question to Elisabeth. When we talked about, when you just mentioned Milo and Berkeley, which is a younger generation than probably most readers than the Zeit has, is there a difference, generation-wise, in the approach of readers to the discussions that you're introducing to them? And is there a greater reluctance of the older ones to be told to discuss with you?
There is no difference, and this is the news I'm most proud of. The best news I can give you is that there's no difference. The young readers are treated by us exactly in the same way as the elder readers are, and the audience is mixed. If you ask me today what my definition of happiness is, it was last Saturday's experience to see that in a huge arena with about 500 people, there were all ages of readers, and they came voluntarily. So I might answer the question differently one day, but today I would say I can't see the problem.
I also have a question that I find very interesting, this discussion, and seeing myself much more on the side of the Economist than the New Yorker, because it creates the following story. You know, President Trump said, I'm not going to take the questions from New York Times or from Washington Post. I don't like them. The questions that they ask me offend me. And what is the response? We basically, Stephen Bannon is a very ugly personality who is part of the public debate. And I do believe this is the trauma of the American media, who took the guilt believing that they simply elected Donald Trump by covering him. And I'm very much interested in this because I do believe that, as you know, sociological data shows the following. The higher your education is, the more tolerant you are when it comes to religion, when it comes to ethnicity, to this type of differences, but more intolerant you are when it comes to people with different political views. And I do believe we start to treat people who disagree with us as people who offend us. And this is becoming an excuse for governments to start to treat media in the same way. So from this point of view, I'm interested in these reflections. What do you believe is going to become? If scared if one David Remnick cannot invite Stephen Bannon, who of the liberal publications are going to dare to do this? What is going to happen if in the next 2 or 3 years you stop, one by one, inviting all these people whom you don't like? Is it not going to become the same what is in Facebook? You're defriending everybody who does not like you.
Well, that's thing I'm also very much worried about, because in my country, media divided by half pro-government, anti-government, and you know, if you try to talk to the other side, you're considered a traitor. We have this word symmetrist, and this is worst curse than anyone, because you're getting from both sides. But I mean, we are more and more entrenched in our bubbles and less prone to open. And I'm not Pollyanna. I don't think that when you have on one hand forces which want to, which are racist or want to take women's rights or are anti-democratic, and on the other side you have forces which have different opinions, that the truth lies somewhere in between, because it doesn't. But on the other hand, we cannot put. I mean, when I read right-wing media in Poland, their narration about us, it's they are all either cynical or useful idiots, and it's the same narration of we have about them. And of course, some of them are cynical or very useful idiots, but it doesn't keep us closer to reaching their audience, because it's like you cannot put half of your population into a basket of deplorables, because they're gonna still be there. And what? California will secede, and East Coast will secede, and the rest of the US gonna be pro-Trump. I mean, it's one country. You have to find a way to talk to each other, at least. Maybe not convince, but at least see a human being in person which disagrees with you, because now it's being more and more dehumanizing.
You're making the point that I think is so missed oftentimes. Everybody that I knew who wrote for the New York Times and the New Yorker was shocked when Donald Trump won, including myself. And that's because we don't know how many people are listening to someone like Steve Bannon. So I think Remnick was right in the logic that he outlined for why he thought to invite him, which is that you need to be aware. He is part of the debate, whether you like it or not. You're just not listening to part of it, but the people who are listening are not going to go away because you close your ears. So I think it's pretty straightforward why you need to be having as much open exchange and actually defeating some of these noxious ideas, and not just merely insulating yourself from them, because you can't actually insulate yourself from them.
Hi there, I'm Lexi Alexander from South Africa. I want to pursue this question of who are we talking to, and ask the speakers if they could address it in terms of what is really the key social issue that we face in the 21st century, and that is one of very high inequality and growing inequality. Because I think it's not enough to say we want to communicate more with the public and to have meetings of 500 people, although that's obviously a very good thing. we do have to give thought to who those 500 people are. Because if we're not careful, it tends to reinforce an existing liberal consensus or particular kind of political position. Now, if I could just say about South Africa, there's no way in which my centre would be able to organise a meeting such as this, because we have to be aware of the way in which most people are very, very poor. They live on the margins of the big cities. If we're to have a genuine public meeting, then we have to organise transport for people to come from those poorer areas. And I wonder sometimes about the meeting that we had yesterday, marvellous as it was fantastic for me to listen to Tim Snyder and to see what was happening in Austria. But to what extent was it excluding people? To what extent was it excluding poorer people, blacker people, immigrants and so on and so forth? Because if we are excluding through our practice, not necessarily through our intentions, but through our practice, then surely we're undermining democracy. And if we're undermining democracy, aren't we then providing fertile ground for the kind of populists who everybody here seems to be denigrating? So I'm wondering if the speakers could say what they do through their own practice to overcome the problems of massive inequality and the way in which it impacts on the kind of voices that are heard inside the media. Because what I see, not only in South Africa, but in the international media as well, is very little credibility given to ordinary people. Okay, sometimes the BBC will interview an ordinary person who was involved in some catastrophe. But they're there as vox pops. They're there without a name. The people who have the names are the politicians, they're the business people, they're the celebrities and so forth. So how do we overcome that problem? How, through our well-established public media, who have some degree of political credibility, do we deal with this particular problem? Because if we don't, then I think we can get to this situation that you're talking about in Poland, where the media lacks credibility, and that lack of credibility increases, and it undermines even further democracy.
I totally agree with what you say, and I would very much like to be able to tell you now that I'm traveling through the countryside, speaking with the disprivileged all day, engaging discussions with them, and no, that would be a lie. Of course, we started with our readers. But what I would very much like to do as a second, third, fourth step is exactly that. Travel to the countryside, go to every school, every hospital, go wherever I can on stations, engage people in discussions. What last happened when I went to one of these East German villages, I spoke to a teacher asking him how he was thinking about our idea of opening the debating arena to our readers. And this teacher, it was just one of the small villages in East Germany which are so depopulated at present because people go to the towns and look for work in the towns. And what he said was, but I can't, I don't speak your language. And, well, this is what I'm traveling on since he told me that he's reading my newspaper. He's a reader of my newspaper. But he told me, I can't, I don't speak your language. So it's a whole translating job, empowerment job, which we will have to do. And I agree with you, all the work has to be done. We haven't even started yet.
As for me, I agree with the concern you have about inequality and what it means for democracy and open society. I'm just not sure that's what writing does. What do I do? Writing is trying to think very seriously about issues and subjects and to express responses to those ideas and subjects as clearly as you possibly can. And that might be all that writing does. Then you have advocacy, you have activism and other things. But I'm, in my writing, I'm just trying to write as well as I can and as honestly as I can.
Well, I agree with you, but we are failing. It's structural also because, when the newspapers start losing revenues, I think which got cut first was all the legwork, that is investigating department or local bureaus. So now most job we do is just sitting in our Warsaw office and writing mostly opinions. because of, as I said, opinions. No, I mean, it's for me, it's more and more self-referencing, because when I read yet another polemic with an opinion, there was a polemic to another opinion, it's just like, I mean, who cares? Who cares about our own Warsaw bubble? Who cares about our Twitter followers or our colleagues from different media? So yeah, I'm failing. What can I do? I know I can interview some expert on basic income, or why Bill Gates is outsourcing saving the world to Bill Gates. It's not the best idea, or how income inequality is threatening life on Earth. Well, global warming, but income inequality also is skyrocketing. I try not to look down on people. I mean, in Poland, there was this stipend for children with 2 kids or more, and they got this 500 zlotys per month, which was a big sum of money for someone. And we have a wave of articles that's going to destroy economy, and those poor people who got those money went for the very first time for summer holidays, and now they are destroying our beaches, they are pissing on our beaches, or they are behaving it was so full of contempt to regular people, to those who are not reading us, who authors of the story thought they are basically better because they're educated and they know that if you go to the beach you should use toy, not bush. So I mean, I try to save. I mean, it's not saving the world, right? But at least I try not to be offensive. Small program, small step.
Thank you. I could contribute a practical example. I was with the students in a certain sport arena, and there was a Chinese student, and then he finally said he's very tough, the prices here, and so I invited him to live with me in my flat. Then my son also lived in my flat, and his colleague student reported him that he has difficulties in all the way, so he invited him too. So finally we had 2 persons invited, not paying for the flat anyway, but very friendly, and we said, however, it is a non-smoking area, especially my son insists in that. Though after a few weeks the student colleague did not comply to the rule and smoked. And after a few days and a few weeks, I finally asked him, please give me the key back for the flat. What would you have done in this case of inclusion?
Well, I would ask if the flat has a balcony. If it has a balcony, go to a balcony.
There's no balcony.
Don't smoke outside.
It is just a small example for the big example. You understand?
This is my house.
Yes, my name is Alex Ratzener. I have one question. You mentioned the loss of trust. And I remember being in a meeting in Phoenix, Arizona, where the CEO of Intel said, well, trust, you have to define trust much more, because, for example, I would, at that point, Clinton was in power. He said, I would trust President Clinton with my country, but I wouldn't trust him with my daughter. So the question is, what is it? What is the trust that you're looking for? Because as a reader, I'll always be skeptical about everything I read. Okay, so that's one thing. And the another question, if I may, is if you always talk to your own readers, but not to other readers of other newspapers, don't you feel that you become a kind of groupthink purveyor and encourager? Thank you.
Okay, so I think this is very basic level of trust, but trust that I'm doing my best to fulfill my duty, how, you know, it sounds very big words, but, you know, basic journalistic duty, that is to try to uncover truth as best I can, to give you facts and differ them from the opinions. And, you know, of course, I cannot be totally objective, it's impossible. I have views, but I can express them in opinion section, not in news section. And, but, you know, I'm not covertly working for some politician, and I try to speak truth to power, another big words, not become a propaganda tube for power.
Well, trust is, for me, that both sides, all sides, make serious efforts to agree on what they are talking about, in order to make sure that they're not simply listening to what the other one says, that they can resonate with the other one says. And this means that you trust in that he is seriously trying to agree on the basis you're talking about. Otherwise you can't create any resonance if just everybody speaks. You would just have 80 million German voices to be heard, but no kind of dialogue, of resonance, and of opinion making. And this is a lot, because I don't know what your experiences are, but my experience is that it becomes quite rare to agree on the facts you're talking about, to frame them in the same way, and to illustrate them in a way which is meant to be convincing, which is meant to reach the other one and not only to close your own shop. And the other answer is, of course, this is my major fear. I want to talk to the city and not to my readers only. I want to engage a discussion with the city, with the polis. But, I mean, you can't have all at the same time. So this is the first step. And it is not easy to discuss with such a huge number of differently perceiving people. And even 500 Zeit readers are perceiving differently, have different profession, different places they live in, different biographical experiences. So this is difficult enough. But I agree, it would even be better to exchange views of different readers and different communities. We'll make that next step one day, sure.
I think you earn trust as a publication by treating readers as adults and telling them things even that they don't want to hear, that are unpleasant for them to hear. And you do that over the course of the long term, and you earn trust. Breitbart News tells its readers only what they want to hear and excludes everything that contradicts their worldview. And they have enthusiasm, they have support, but I don't think that they have what I would define as trust from their readers, because their readers must on some level know that they're not getting a whole world. The New York Times does get trust because I think it messes up, but it acknowledges as best it can when it messes up, and it tells its reader things, it treats its readership as adults. I think that's the best that you can do.
I think, I have the impression we all agree that the dialogue with the readers is very important, so the readers are not only paying you, you have to have some mutual confidence, you have to have these debates, which I find very impressive, but at the same time you have to draw lines between the representation and the inclusion of the reader, the response of the editors. Now I have a very, I feel, delicate issue. You meet sometimes your readers in person, but what happens when you meet them in the digital world? Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking about the misrepresentation and particularly about the info wars, which Timothy Snyder also talked last night about. So what happens if the representative opinion you have in the commentaries under the articles, and they're very selective, and sometimes you feel there is something like a campaign against things, and particularly, as you mentioned, it's very often about immigrants, sexuality, sexual violence, and so on. and it gives the impression of a shift of focus, and we all know the term is agenda setting. How can you manage that as an editor and also on the technological level to still have a dialogue with the readers, which is very important? We all feel it's not a very good idea just to close the commentary and say no. It's also, moderation is not the only solution, because you can filter out the aggressiveness, but how you manage a misrepresentation of that opinion, an overrating, so to say.
Very difficult question, and I'm very bad at understanding how to deal with this issue. There's days where you simply sit crying in your room because you don't support this aggressiveness any longer and don't want to reply to anybody anymore, because of course all these readers reach you directly, very actively, very directly. They just write you an email, they just send you a comment. There is no distance, no line. So it is very difficult to deal with this aggressiveness. I usually look for an understanding with my colleagues in order to proceed in a similar way, not in an individual way, to build groups, to build rules. And we have now reached in the Zeit a new tool which I often use, and this tool allows you not to answer. And you simply press a button and then you have the right not to answer the insult or the aggression or whatever it is. But this is something very new, and I should maybe have said it before. The type of aggression which reaches me now, I didn't even know that existed before, let's say the year 2000. Anonymously, and personally, aggression which, is personally addressed to my person, my name. I didn't know that existed before.
Can I add something, sir? Yeah. When you talk about the tool, does that mean that you actively put that email that you don't want to answer into some digital archive? Do you mark it and then say, I'm not answering this, but for history to know I got this email because I have the same problems every day and I just don't answer them. But obviously you go on a step further in that respect too.
Yeah, I couldn't explain it technologically. It is simply a button which I can push, and this answers to my colleagues in the technological department that I'm not going to answer to this comment, so they know, and the reader, the commenter gets the same answer, that he won't get an answer. No.
Thank you very much. I'm Zsuzsa Szelényi, I'm from Hungary. And a couple of days ago, I'm a fellow here in EVM at the moment. A few days ago, we've heard that the Ministry of Interior in Austria distributed a letter to the local police stations to warn them not to share information, basically not to talk to kind of non-friendly media, which was a kind of outrage here in Austria, which I am not surprised, of course, because this has been long like this in Hungary. This is the first step to kill any kind of discourse and debate, when the power is not engaged itself to even having questions, not specific debate. So we in Hungary are in a stage then when the participants of the power and of course a lot of power-friendly or urban-friendly intellectuals simply don't speak to anyone else. So there is no debate. It's almost vanished from the Hungarian political arena. It's very specific. There is a 90%, as you said, and of course there's a small, let's call open media. And I've heard, and there is no an initiative of, I think it's coming from Austria or probably Germany. One of the media tried to engage readers to recreate the discourse. So specifically involve people from this kind of decision or opinion on a certain critical issue and another type of opinion, and then they bring these people together in a public space and they discuss. Do you think, is it a role of media to recreate the discourse, and is this a good way to do this? You mentioned this discussion with the audience, with the readers, which I find very important, and also because of a saving democracy purpose. But this is a bit different, what I'm saying, that it's actually recreating something which disappeared or disappearing.
Well, unfortunately, I've got the impression that all I say is just embrace uncertainty, and all I'm trying to do is embracing uncertainty. I don't know the answer, not at all. What I know is that it is a good Enlightenment tradition to perceive a journal and the media as mediators. And we will never be able to deliver immediacy. That is impossible. We are mediators. So I understand the role, and many others do now, as an active challenge to organize the controversies in a society, to contribute at least to organize these controversies. I would say this is now a challenge for the media, yes, but I understand those who say I'm there for writing brilliant texts and keep my distances to every and each citizen and reader. I understand this very well as well. Maybe we have to go different ways at the same time and understand it as an experiment. Democratic experimentalism is my answer to nearly everything at present. But show up and show that you're accountable and that you exist and that you are ready to show up and to show your face and to make your voice heard. Well, to be continued.
I'm not sure if it's our role, to be perfectly honest. I mean, we are watchdogs, we are not community organizers, and I mean, I'll maybe shift the discussion a little bit, because I mean, there are maybe in desperate times we need desperate measure. Like in Poland, we have this discussion over if journalists can attend demonstration. Are we more journalists or more citizen? If there's demonstration against taking away one of the fundaments of liberal democracy, which is independent judiciary. So can we take part in it or not? Can I, as a woman, attend Black March, which is against trying to take away last remaining right to have a legal abortion in Poland or not? And you know, some journalists in Poland say no, you have to be totally impartial. You are more journalists than citizens. Other go on to the demonstration. And you know, in normal times, I would agree with, I think it's New York Times policy that you can never go. You're mostly a journalist, but you know, they're not normal times. But still, I don't see media as that kind of organizers.
So I'm concerned about a certain illusion that I think we're having. There's something, you said something about we living in abnormal times, and I think we are. I mean, everybody feels this. There's something is changing. And it's certainly the case in America, where United States, where I live. The idea that you referred to the Enlightenment, and this idea of expanding discourse and reaching across. There's a book you may know by Ali Huschild called Strangers in Their Own Land. And she's got this idea of crossing the wall of empathy. She likes this phrase, which she tries to do. She does it in a very serious way. She's an anthropologist, sociologist, anthropologist. And it's all about figuring out what the supporters of the Tea Party and then eventually Trump voters, how they live their lives to try to get across this wall. And this is a noble ideal. You're right, it comes from the Enlightenment. It's It's the way we liberal democratic people think. But I think what we actually are seeing, one of the ways in which the times have become abnormal, is that there is a whole idea among politicians, I'm thinking now of the United States, Republicans. Look at what just happened with the vote about Kavanaugh. I think you have to face the fact that there is a whole political party in the United States more or less united against this very idea. I mean, one way to put this, I like to put it this way, is that I think the polarization which we all see, I mean, you talked about living in bubbles. It's true, we do all live in bubbles. But I think that the politics of it now, in the United States, but also elsewhere, is becoming increasingly asymmetrical. That's to say, the idea of the United States, the idea of the Republicans, is actually not to think of the discourse as something that could be carried on across the aisle, across the barrier. It's actually to prevent it. We're actually facing a world in which the project, it's not symmetrically set out. We're facing actually people who want politics to be a relationship between enemies. And therefore, if that's true, this idea that, you know, the project, let's say in the newspapers, or let's say among sociologists, anthropologists, is to cross the wall of empathy, you have to face the fact that there's a whole political class, or segment of the political class, that's actually against this very project. I wonder what you think about that.
That's a very well put insight, and I tend to agree with you, but I think that sentiment exists on segments of the left as well, especially if you go on college campuses and places like this, and if you go on segments of Twitter. That impulse is bipartisan, actually. I think that it belongs to one political party that governs more than the other, but that sentiment exists in citizens across the political spectrum. But I agree with your assessment 100%.
Yes, me too. I agree with you and what you say. And once again, I don't have an answer, but pragmatically, I would say on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, I try to cross the wall, and on the other days, I stay with me and my friends and try to do my very best to find out what I'm thinking myself and not only dialoguing with others. I mean, there's 7 days a week.
I'm all for crossing the wall of empathy and trying to see human beings and people we disagree with, but in the age of social media, it's getting increasingly difficult. There was this interesting experiment held earlier this year by 3 American universities, and for a month they used this bot who would give Republican Twitter users retweets of Democratic politicians, Democratic pundits, Democrats, and the other way around to the Democrats, the Republican ones. So what happened after this month? Do any of them change opinion in any way? No, being expressed to to views of the other party, but in forms of memes, outrageous voices, and 280 characters made them only more, Republicans became more conservative and Democrats became more democratic, because it's not enough to show somebody a meme or be sarcastic or shame somebody into submission. It's not. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a conversation. It takes being patient, and it takes humility, because you have to give the small space for thinking that you may not be right in everything, which is also very difficult. So this social media age in which what's being promoted is being fast and radical, it doesn't give us much hope to cross this wall of empathy.
Okay, I think that we'll bring our session to a close, and I'd like to thank everyone for turning out this evening, and especially I'd like to thank the three people up here who did most of the talking and reflecting.